Today is the third Sunday of Lent, and we will again hear some more of Jesus' last words from the cross in the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verses 25 through 27. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom Jesus loved standing nearby, he said to her, "Woman, here is your son." And to the disciple, "Here is your mother." From that time on, this disciple took her into his home. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Being the American history buff that I am, I recently listened to an audiobook called Destiny of the Republic, which was about the assassination of President James Garfield. Garfield was shot in a train station by a mentally ill political office seeker named Charles Guiteau on July 2nd, 1881. And he died about 2 months later from an infection in the gunshot wound because the doctors did not believe in washing their hands at that point. Yeah, it was pretty rough. The book talked about how tremendously horrified and upset the American public was when the news of the shooting was released, and how the public emotion grew even more intense after the president died. The author of this book explained that James Garfield was the first U.S. president who was widely supported by both Republicans and Democrats, blacks and whites, Northerners and Southerners, and everyone in between since the end of the Civil War. This was due to his ability to compromise and work with Americans of all political views, generally uniting them all under one American identity again. His death also drew Americans closer in unified mourning of their beloved president, and subsequently compelled them to call for Charles Guiteau's swift execution. Tens of thousands of people requested tickets to see Guiteau's execution in a D.C. jail, and though only 250 tickets were given, thousands of people waited outside the jail to hear the news of Guiteau's exact moment of death and respond by erupting in thunderous applause and shouts of joy. Jesus was obviously not a criminal like Guiteau was, but as we've been examining the final words and moments of Jesus' life in detail through Lent, we could see that there were a lot of people present at Calvary who were just as eager to witness Jesus' death as the Americans were to witness Guiteau's execution. There were loads of angry Jewish leaders and other disgruntled Jews who wanted to see Jesus die and were counting down the seconds until this radical rabbi from Nazareth was no longer on earth to disrupt their traditions. And then there were a few members of Jesus' family and close friends who stood at the foot of the cross watching in unspeakable horror and sorrow as their beloved Jesus slipped away. 3 of these mourners were women, all named Mary to make it more confusing for us. And the 4th was John, who was the so-called beloved disciple and maybe the author of this gospel. Despite the constant onslaught of taunts coming at Jesus from the witnesses and soldiers and the criminals that were also crucified with him, Jesus still noticed his beloved friends and family standing before him. He saw his mother, who was likely filled with a mixture of grief for her son's suffering, awe at the amazing love of God, and fear and anxiety about her future without her son. Women were second-class citizens at this time, so they relied on their fathers, husbands, or sons to take care of them. We don't know where Mary's other children were at this time, and likely neither did Jesus. So when he saw John standing with her, he knew that John would be a good caretaker. So Jesus presented John to her as her new son, who would provide the care and protection she needed throughout her life. John was not just chosen as a caretaker, though, simply because he was standing at the right place at the right time. As we've seen, John always refers to himself in the gospel as the beloved disciple, or the disciple who Jesus loved, depending on your translation. I always kind of bristled at that claim because it makes it seem like Jesus loved John more than the other disciples, and it's like Jesus loved for all, loves everyone equally, died for all. Like, I don't think Jesus would have favorites. That's just my opinion, but perhaps John means this that Jesus and John were best friends. I mean, Jesus was a human like us, and maybe he had best friends too. But if John was Jesus' best friend and he knew him well, then Jesus would have been 100% confident that John would take care of his mother after he died, resurrected, and ascended to heaven. Jesus gave these instructions to John for his mother, not only as a concerned son, but as God's word himself, reminding us all of the fifth commandment: honor your father and mother, so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you, from Exodus 20. This commandment can be applied to both young children and adult children. Children should certainly respect their elders and follow their guidance, which is aimed to raise the children as good people and good Christians. But as adults, we are also expected to take care of our parents as they age. They took care of us, and now it's time for us to take care of them as best we can. I know that y'all know this. I've seen it in action at this church, even in the few months that I've been here. From the youth raising money for ALS research in honor of their beloved youth group leader, to several of you visiting and caring for our homebound members, whether they're related to you by blood or not, I can see the deep love and respect for our elders that flows through this family of faith. I could also see this love and respect for elders expressed in grief at their passing. Many of you were in tears in the days and weeks after Marie Gumb's death, whether you were related to her by blood or by the Spirit of Christ. And though I did not have the pleasure of getting to know her for long, I could see that she made a great impact on your lives as you made an impact on hers. And grief is one of the signs of deep heartfelt respect for a person that has gone to be with the Lord. And the beloved disciple shows us how powerful it can be, both personally and communally. John likely needed Mary as much as she needed him in those days, weeks, and years following the crucifixion, since he was grieving Jesus' death as well. And Jesus tells his disciples years before his death that those who mourn will be blessed, for they will be comforted in both sympathy and in empathy from fellow mourners. So Mary and John could comfort each other in the difficult years ahead of them, forming a bond of love and friendship that is made possible through Christ. Though Jesus only spoke directly to his mother and to John, the other two women at the cross are important in the life of Jesus and in the ongoing ministry of the church as well. Mary Magdalene was one of the many female disciples of Jesus, and the one who would be the first to see the empty tomb on Easter morning and the resurrected Jesus. She is the first one Jesus sent to share the news of the resurrection to the rest of the disciples and to the world. And Mary, wife of Clopas, was actually Jesus' aunt. Her husband Clopas was Joseph's brother, and therefore Clopas and Mary were Virgin Mary's brother-in-law. I have to try to differentiate the Marys. There are too many of them. Adam Hamilton explains that when Joseph died, Clopas and Mary most likely welcomed Virgin Mary and her children into their home and formed a close bond of kin and friendship with them as they mourned the loss of Joseph together. It is no wonder then that Jesus' aunt was there to console her sister-in-law as she witnessed one of the hardest things a mother would ever have to see or go through. Both Mary, wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene were present at the cross to hear Jesus' instructions to John and to see the example he was setting for them and for the rest of the church by caring for Jesus' mother and all that implied. But they set their own examples too. Mary and Clopas already knew what it was like to take care of their family members as they cared for their sister-in-law and her children. But they also played a crucial role in preparing and enhancing the healthy growth of the church, perhaps without really knowing it at the time. They not only helped Mary raise Jesus as a boy, but their own son, Simeon, would grow up to become a leader of the Church of Jerusalem after James and Peter died, carrying the fragile church through the heavy persecution from the Roman Empire. Mary Magdalene carried the ministry of the church by not only spreading the news of the resurrection, but also in taking care of her fellow disciples and her Messiah. Mary, along with many other women, offered their own help and resources to Jesus and the 12 during their traveling ministry, as Jesus asked them to. In this, Mary Magdalene and other women were setting an example for all women in the church. Other women that Jesus chose for his ministry were Martha and Mary of Bethany, who were the ones that waited on Jesus and worshiped him and poured perfume on his feet for burial. And by choosing these women to participate in his ministry and by associating with them at all, Jesus broke the status quo, which made a lot of people upset enough to crucify him. But this is another example that he has set for all of us throughout history, which some have faithfully followed. There are the three Marys and John associated with the rejected Jesus at his execution, showing us all that we can stand with those who are on the margins. And another were those who knew Charles Guiteau. Although Guiteau got the execution many thought he deserved for senselessly killing an innocent and beloved president, he was still a human being with some family who loved him. Most of his family members essentially shunned him as a young adult due to his insanity and his poor life choices. In addition to being a murderer, Guiteau was a scammer and a thief, refusing to pay hotel bills and essentially making a living by borrowing money from friends and acquaintances without paying them back. But his sister Frances and brother-in-law George remained loyal to him until he died, often taking care of him and providing him with money when he needed it. After the death of Garfield, Guiteau's brother-in-law pleaded with President Chester Arthur to grant Guiteau a pardon, and when that didn't work, his sister begged Garfield's widow to offer forgiveness and a pardon that could have potentially saved his life. Both pleas were rejected, and Garfield's family was livid after Frances had the audacity to even suggest forgiving their enemy. And, we can understand that. I mean, I know that I would not be ready to forgive someone who murdered someone that I loved. But, knowing that Guiteau also had a beloved sister, there's both sides of that. Guiteau's sister and brother-in-law were not present at his execution. Excuse me. Like Jesus' family was at his, but we can assume that they mourned for their brother just as anyone would mourn for a loved one, no matter what he or she did. Loving those on the margins can certainly be more difficult than loving our friends and family. I know this church knows how to love each other and take care of each other. Just last week, you all raised about $700, I believe, to help Caitlin and Mark as they struggle through some of the impacts of Mark's health scare from the week before. You all are very eager to help each other both in and outside of the church, offering to help with everything from changing a flat tire on your intern's car to donating your time and possessions to the needy in the surrounding community. You warmly welcome pastoral interns every year as part of this family of faith and help them grow in their calling to the ministry, and I confidently pray that you will welcome your new pastor in July with the same amount of love, warmth, and respect. Sometimes it can be difficult to welcome someone into your family, especially if they break some of the status quo that you're used to. We don't know what the daily life of John and Mary looked like after they began living together. Maybe they got along well for the most part, but there were some things that got on each other's nerves, maybe, if they're human, like all of us. A friend of mine allowed her daughter and granddaughter to live with her for a few months while her daughter was looking for a job in a new apartment. And my friend told me that she loves her daughter and granddaughter very dearly, but did not know how annoying it would be to live with them until they started doing little things that bugged her, like leaving their wet towels on the floor in the bathroom and not cleaning up after themselves, after dinner, stuff like that. But despite the changes that might have been made to accommodate Mary into his life, John was ready to open his heart and home to her as her new son. And we should all be willing to do that as well, to welcome our beloved into our hearts and into our family of faith. As we ponder all that God has said to us, let us hear another monologue, this time from Mary, the wife of Clopas, as we allow ourselves to become even nearer to the cross of Jesus.
I begged her not to follow as Jesus was led to be crucified. "Mary, this will be too hard," I said. "You don't want to see this." But she said to me, "I will not let my son die with all those wolves." And so we went, joined by only one disciple, the young John, and by Mary of Magdalene. Jesus' mother was a strong and determined woman, and she loved her son so very much, more than any other mother would love her son. He was her joy, her life, her purpose for existence. Jesus had sought to prepare her for what lay ahead in Jerusalem. Somehow, she had always known that he would die a young man, giving his life to save this world. Mary was determined to stand near Jesus as he suffered. She would fight to hold back the tears, seeking to show her son strength and love. She would do all she could standing there to ease his pain and give him hope. Now, as the crowds hurled their insults, Mary slowly pushed her way through until she could stand before Jesus. There he hung, withering in pain. His feet were just 2 feet off the ground from where Mary stood. She could just reach up and touch his chest, though the Roman soldiers forbid such a thing. As she stood there, Mary said to Jesus, "I love you, my son. Your father will soon come for you. You are in his hands. I love you." It was then that Jesus looked at his mother and spoke slowly and tenderly to her. "Dear woman, this is your son." He nodded his head toward John, and then to John he said, "Here is your mother." John placed his arm around Mary and held her as if to say to Jesus, "I understand, and I'll take care of her." And I know that he would, and I knew that Mary would be all right.
Let us consider these two questions in silence, in the silence of our hearts. And you may want to write them down so that you can ponder them this week if you like. Who might Jesus be asking you to embrace and include as part of your family? And how can the church be like John and care for those who are grieving?